Good evening and welcome. It's an honor to introduce Norman. Norman L. Kleeblatt is the Susan and Elihu Rose Chief Curator of the Jewish Museum in New York. Over the past 20 years, Norman has played a key role in shaping the holdings of the Jewish Museum, acquiring unique, culturally relevant works in various media for the collection of fine arts. These acquisitions include a range of important works from historical and contemporary artists such as Yael Bartana, William Kentridge, Anselm Kiefer, Lee Krasner, and Mark Rothko. Norman is renowned for his highly original, well-crafted, and broad-ranging exhibitions. An important example was his 2008 award-winning show for the Jewish Museum, Action Abstraction, Pollock, de Kooning, and American Art, 1940 to 1976, which traveled to the St. Louis Art Museum and the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo. This exhibition focused on the aesthetic and intellectual rivalry of two major New York critics of the mid-20th century, Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg. Norman's many other curatorial achievements include The Dreyfus Affair, Art, Truth, and Justice, 1987, Too Jewish, Challenging Traditional Identities, 1996, John Singer Sargent, Portraits of the Wertheimer Family, 2000. He was also co-curator for An Expressionist in Paris, The Paintings of Chaim Soutine, 1998, and Painting a Place in America, Jewish Artists in New York, 1900 to 1945, from 1991. Norman just opened a wonderful exhibition, which I had the great fortune to see a couple of weeks ago, called Mel Bachner, Strong Language, a survey of well-known conceptual artist and painter Mel Bachner that was labeled by the New York Times as an elegantly produced exhibition of a major New York artist. Norman's articles have appeared in Art in America, Art Forum, the Art Journal, and Art News. He has been honored as a recipient of support from the Getty Research Institute, the National Endowment of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Rockefeller Foundation. He currently serves on the boards of both the Vera List Center for Art and Politics of the New School and as vice president on the U.S. section of the International Association of Art Critics. Please join me in welcoming Norman Kleeblatt.
I would hug and kiss you all, especially, can you hear me?
No, we don't need this. 'Cause you have
That's right, because I'm wired for sound. But I don't want to give anyone my awful cold that hopefully you won't have to struggle through too much, but I will. I'm very honored to be here as a guest of both Stanford University's Center and CJM and the JCC San Francisco. It's been wonderful thinking about what to present here and working with three different institutions to produce one program in this very dynamic city. So, to begin, the Jewish Museum hosted a retrospective in May 1979 of the Lithuanian-born, Boston-bred artist David Aronson. Organized by a commercial gallery and previously exhibited at the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University, the exhibition covered nearly 40 years of the artist's career. The history of its installation at the Jewish Museum offers a glimpse into the then iconophobia of among Jewish scholars and people interested in Jewish culture, who until the last several decades were often more comfortable with text and images. It also confirms philosopher, cultural critic, and curator Bruno Latour's observation about societal diffidence towards both religious images and contemporary art. Although far from Radical artistically, as you can see here, Aronson's modern expressionist representation demonstrated not only the evolution of his style, but also the transformation of his subject matter. Aronson, like most 20th century artists, and certainly artists before him, were greatly influenced by Christian imagery, which, after all, was the cornerstone of Western art history. Aronson began his career obsessed with a host of Christian subjects, from martyrdoms and crucifixions to adorations and resurrections. On the one hand, one could consider such choices unusual for an artist with a strong Orthodox Jewish background. On the other, Aronson could well have served as the model for the artist in Chaim Potok's hyper-romantic 1972 novel, My Name is Asher Lev, a book that became a mass-market sentimental bestseller for a sizable niche of mainly Jewish readers. In his mature work, however, Aronson embraced Jewish subjects. One might say he returned to the Judaism, as one would think of at the time, and I think today one would call it Jewishness of his youth, focusing his art with almost equal obsession and exclusivity on biblical themes and subjects from Jewish literature, pedagogy, and mysticism. Despite the prospect of reading the artist's career as a parable of quasi-apostasy and a return to faith, it was determined that the Jewish Museum not show these early Christian subjects. Such material was deemed, quote unquote, offensive by the then chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the museum's parent institution at the time, and an institution at that time that wielded considerable power over the museum's programming. Ironically, this righteous decision ignored the ethical compromises of a museum sponsoring a show organized by a commercial art gallery. Put simply, the seminary forbade the exhibition of Christian subjects at a Jewish institution. A quick solution was forged with the National Academy of Design only 2 blocks south of the Jewish Museum, and the Academy displayed the offending pictures during the run of the Jewish Museum show. The then chancellor, and I can mention his name, Gershon Cohen, judgment was predicated entirely on assumptions about the external meanings of those images, and for that matter, on a very surface reading of them. His verdict ignored the context of the history of art and the artist's biography, as well as the metaphorical associations such subjects signify when deployed by a modern Jewish artist. And for a museum, the Jewish Museum, that just had a Chagall show that focused a whole gallery on the Jewish Jesus, it shows how far Jewish history, Jewish art history, and Jewish culture has moved. I will not use the term progressed. The verdict, in any event, for a scholar committed to Jewish-Christian dialogue, and Gerson Cohen was well known for that, it also overlooked the possibilities that these early and late pictures could offer for a bi-religious discourse. It would take Ziva Amishai Meisel's path-breaking article on the Jewish Jesus, published 3 years later, to explain the political, historical, and iconographic ramifications for the role of the image Jesus played for Jewish artists in the wake of the 19th century pogroms and the Holocaust. In fact, the potential of this retrospective to teach, to offer a lesson, or a derash, if you will, about routes to self-discovery, about the search for both artistic and religious identities, were simply foreclosed. The idea of sequestering aberrant images outside the confines of the Jewish Museum had an effect quite the opposite of the intended erasure. It actually drew attention, or greater attention, to these early subjects. Publicly, the exhibition became a biblical metaphor, a proverbial child now physically divided in two, thus precluding for many viewers the chance to experience the artist's chronology firsthand and to comprehend the stylistic and symbolic character of Aronson's artistic output. The prohibition against showing Aronson's earlier works had a less salutary effect, as you see on the screen. It was read publicly as censorship. The New York Times devoted a major article on the story and one editorial decrying the chancellor's intercession. The artist himself spoke of this censorial act as one that annulled the quote unquote freedom of thought that has traditionally come from Judaism and Jewish minds, end quote. The fear of images and unwillingness to probe the range of connotations for this contemporary artist's project ultimately trapped the works in a religious alternative limbo, freezing the art's meaning as one-dimensional rather than open to a range of interpretations. My first encounter with provocative and disturbing images came from discovering in the storerooms of the Jewish Museum a cache of anti-Semitic posters from the end of the 19th century related to the notorious Dreyfus Affair. The suite of more than 50 posters from the series The Museum of Horrors, Musée des Horreurs, features images of Alfred Dreyfus, various Dreyfusards, and as well as a number of politically uncommitted Jews caught in the firing line of the scandal. And just for an example, would be the Rothschilds, who kept their heads ducked during the entire time of the Dreyfus Affair. The faces of the depicted antagonists appear with near photographic precision. The bodies are articulated with debased Darwinian forms as monstrous animals. The series was offered for sale by subscription. In other words, if you were any good law-abiding French citizen with a few dollars in your pocket, you could have these delivered to your home on a weekly basis, following Dreyfus's 1899 trial in Rennes. Seeing these shocking images that accompanied the international cause célèbre, I wondered why the then current literature on 19th century French art that I'd been taught in graduate school was crammed with everything from advertising posters for fashion and journals to butter and bicycles. Never did I see a political poster in all my graduate courses, nor the poster craze that was in vogue in the early 1980s. You never saw a poster that was anything but sort of lovely and charming and beautiful and sinewy. Though produced by an artist under the pseudonym of Lenepveux, I was further infuriated or irritated that the posters heretofore unknown to me, a lack on the part of what I considered my teachers in the literature at the time, were represented with exceptional graphic skill. I quickly learned that the reasons Jewish institutions collected such material was to keep them out of the hands of the wrong people who might deploy them maliciously. The questions this cache raised for me initially were, could a museum, in particular a Jewish museum, or the museum I worked for, the Jewish Museum New York, ever show anti-Semitica? How might such works offer a corrective to art historical scholarship that until then had postulated a rosy glow view of French fin de siècle commercialism via visual culture? If one could show these works, what would the appropriate context be for their display and interpretation? Historically, art historically, culturally. Took quite a number of years for me to find the answers, but evidently it led to the first major project I ever did was called The Dreyfus Affair, Art, Truth, and Justice. And this was a gallery with these posters, and they were displayed en masse, about 25 of them, which was devoted to the commercial culture around the Dreyfus Affair. And I think one of the great synergies about that moment was that it was the collision of mass media, new technology, and politics. And they worked hand in hand. So included in the gallery, you could find things like ladies' accessories like folding fans, pro-Dreyfus when you went to the opera or theater, or anti-Dreyfus. Pro and anti-Dreyfus board games that you see on the left. And other sometimes terrifying tchotchkes, including the Dreyfusard people, personages, in looking like fetuses and stuffed in little glass bottles. They were just terrifying, like medical experiments that were actually carved out of ivory. The airing of such dirty laundry allowed both historians and art historians to reevaluate the era, with someone like art historian Paul Tucker urging using the show to explain the fact that Claude Monet moved to Giverny because he couldn't stand the politics of Paris anymore. And Jewish historian Richard Cohen, who urged historians to use art and visual culture to expand the documents of historical practice. Instances like these of disconcerting images and symbolic narratives that engage seemingly taboo and forbidden imagery have cropped up frequently in my career, as well as in recent bibliographies of what some people still call Jewish art. Obviously, a terminology that I have a problem with. Such challenging images and situations might provoke a deliberate repression, might be deemed unreadable, unexhibitable, verboten. However, by questioning them, one can often explore and expand the delicate intersection of art history and material culture with the study of Jewish history and text. And I feel it's these situations that have shown me, at least, how an open dialogue, as well as a dialogue between and among disciplines, present opportunities to reinterpret or thoughtfully reimagine the art in question. So let's return to my opening idea about Jewish iconophobia with a painting whose subject matter speaks directly to the point. The painting in question exhibits another conservative aesthetic, as well as an unusual iconography and manner of representation. By the Polish artist Maurice Minkowski and completed in 1910, this work was curiously titled, "He Cast a Look and Was Hurt." Ignored because of its academic style, its Eastern European origin, its dark tonalities, and its Hermetic Jewish subject. In 1982, the painting was all of a sudden slated to be shown at the Kunsthalle Düsseldorf, which was at the time certainly the richest and most powerful contemporary art institution in Germany. But the director of this important institution quickly understood the picture's import, as he himself was trying to expand the then European canon to include the canon of to include artists who were then from behind what was the Iron Curtain. To my knowledge, this is one of the few paintings in Western art that takes the Talmud as its subject. In fact, the title of Minkowski's work comes directly from the Talmudic tractate Hagigah 14b, a passage that deals in a highly emblematic way with the temptation of four sages who enter a garden. In it, they symbolically encounter sensual pleasures and or esoteric knowledge. The narrative may well have carried additional significance for a deaf painter who became one of the first generation of Jews permitted to study art in Eastern Europe. The painting can also be read as a parable for rabbinical attitudes towards visual temptation, the radical nature at the time of a Jew choosing to become a visual artist, and not least, our inability to control visual stimuli. And I think we know that all the more living in an era of electronic bombardment. The narrative, in any way, briefly summarized, Hagigah 14b recounts the range of responses of each of four sages to an alluring visual and sensual experience. The titular character, Ben Azai, is said to, quote, have cast a look and died. His death is considered saintly. Ben Zoma went insane, and Ben Avuya became an apostate. Avoiding temptation for our purposes and for our metaphorical purposes, that is looking, Akiva, whose dead-ahead gaze in the Minkowski painting is unflinching, and he was the only one of the four sages left unscathed. Interpretations of the Minkowski painting will always remain nuanced and mysterious, but it still cries out for continued study across different disciplines. At the time I first sought to dig more deeply into the work, I came away with a surface understanding of a method to clarify the picture's meanings that come out of Jewish culture at that period of creation. This included a post-Enlightenment tradition that interpreted Ben Avuya's decision not as apostasy, but rather as the modern struggle to reconcile the secular and the sacred, the visual and the textual. Art historically, the interpretation had to remain tolerant of the artist retardataire style as consistent within certain belated traditions of East European painting. But the meaning of the picture's curious iconographic strategies of these three groups before, during, and after of men. It's not a typical dramatic encounter that one has in post-Renaissance art where you focus on a single dramatic moment in the narrative, but rather it probably harks back to some kind of medieval or even early Christian depiction of temporal space. And additionally, Minkowski probably did not yet know or care about the emergence of Cubist syntax, which was just exploding at the time as a potential means of depicting different times and spaces. So another fascinating problem was 1993, a painting, a fantastic mid-20s painting by immigrant artist Peter Bloom appeared on the art market. Its subject was shocking. I studied Bloom's earlier career in preparation for an exhibition about Jewish artists in New York from 1900 to 1945. This painting, titled Pig's Feet in Vinegar, was painted in the same year Peter Bloom left his longtime home on New York's Lower East Side for the genteel countryside of rural New England, where he would spend the remaining 60-plus years of his life. And by the way, I always find this amazing because they're artists of such different sensibilities, that it was Peter Bloom who found Arshil Gorky had committed suicide in the barn next door to him. So they were very close friends, although working in very different artistic métiers. So what could be the meaning of this blatant, severed, virtually levitating hooves of Trafe? What do the images of the severed tree and the unfinished house denote? Or the house that's lying on its side, almost looking like a coffin? Was the artist's decision intentional to abruptly frame the mullions and transoms of the window so that they form a crucifix? Surely this picture encodes the artist's discomfort with his religious identity, as well as his alienation from the new symbols of New England culture. Who is the woman outside the window? Is she a temptress of the new, or is she a reminder of the old world? After all, this was a pivotal point in Peter Bloom's life and of radical change in his surroundings. And I want to remind you that the New England he moved to, this Western New England, was in the 20s and 30s the proverbial American pastoral, if you will, or to sort of subquote Peter, Philip Roth, thank you. Thought I'd never get there. And it symbolized bucolic, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant-dominated America. How far this artist had moved from the teeming streets and immigrant Jewish populations of the Lower East Side, geographically and culturally. However, the images he created are obviously highly crafted, including the sand-based wall, where the artist actually included sand in the smooth grayish wall to the on your left. But this was a complex symbolism and jarring representation that he forged in Pig's Feet and Vinegar, what Julia Kristeva has termed a semiotics of biblical abomination, which seemed almost too embarrassing to discuss with a Jewish scholar. Yet Kristeva had already used her eponymous article to reconcile interpretations of two different academic disciplines. I consulted at the time with the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Ismar Shorsh at the time, and rather than decry the artist's depiction of the forbidden food or shun the obvious crucifix form of the window's mullions and transoms, he offered this interpretation, claiming that, and this was quite fascinating for me, that Jewish tradition had long imagined the pig as symbol of religious deception, displaying its cloven feet in order to persuade Jews that it was not counterfeit. In Bloom's painting, the pig is not an expression of extreme alienation, but brings forth an acute awareness of that assimilation is fraught with danger. And that's a quote from Ismar. This analysis, remarkably similar to the temptations found in the Minkowski painting, offered a different lens through which to understand the picture and in which to interpret it through Jewish eyes. The picture's ambiguity and symbolism again permitted scholars and viewers alike to better understand and interpret the fine line early Jewish artists, and remember, Jews really only were permitted to enter art schools in the 19th century in Western Europe and in the very late 19th century in Eastern Europe. And in America, there was perhaps one Jewish artist in the 19th century, perhaps two, and art schools started to accept Jews in the very early years of the 20th century. At the same time, what was interesting for me with this picture is that it added a new iconography, an iconography of the prescribed, to the rubric of what comes under the term art related to Jewish culture. So I bring you up to my current work. In preparation for the current exhibition on the work of conceptual artist Mel Bachner that Laurie so graciously mentioned, I began to review his nearly 50-year-long career with a specific focus on works that dealt with words, text, language, and the thesaurus in particular. And Bachner believes, who comes from an observant Jewish background in Pittsburgh, believes his interest in language is deeply rooted in Jewish thinking, with its inherent focus on text and interpretation. And I have to say that Mel Bachner is also very nervous about being labeled a Jewish artist. And he would say that right here. By extension, a populist aspect of this might be the fact that some of his recent thesaurus paintings are peppered with Yiddishisms, which he observes have entered American English, and you actually find Yiddish words in the latest 2001 edition of Roget's Thesaurus. Other examples are focused entirely on this language. Here is one in a project, it was a multiple artist project called Language Barrier, and it was these barriers that kept trucks off the street from blocking into new construction, was initially commissioned in 2006 by the Spertus Museum, or the Spertus Institute in Chicago, during the construction of its new building. And for those of you who don't know, the Spertus is a major Jewish learning center. Language Barrier is the first work in which Bachner focuses on what he considers the original ghetto language, created in opposition to a foreign and hostile reality. The Yiddish terms he uses indicate his observations of the ironic, skeptical, and even scatological nature of that European tongue. It surprised me to realize that Bachner's seemingly amusing, benign, and evidently celebratory proposal for the Spertus at first met with dissension. The project was near victim of the Spertus Board's suspicion about the image and about making, this is a quote I would love to feel I invented, but I didn't, a too Jewish public statement. In this case, it was called perhaps inappropriate for the institution, and a great debate followed about whether it could be realized at all. Yet the artists and communities won out, and the nature of the Yiddish language and the attributes that Bachner reveals here serve as paradigms for the artist's own exploration of English synonyms as an offshoot of his recent thesaurus paintings. Bachner created additional versions of the Joys of Yiddish with a major painting in 2012, and other word pictures that celebrate the humorous essence of the Yiddish language, which, given the terms he chooses, show, again, how much American English has assimilated Yiddish. So as opposed to the controversy at the Spertus, a Jewish institution in Chicago, here is Mel Bachner had a show last year at the Haus der Kunst in Munich, and he proposed that he would put a Joys of Yiddish on the architrave of this infamous building, actually. And Bachner sort of offered a courageous return of the repressed. Here, Bachner superimposed the lingua franca of his family heritage on the facade of a gallery built by Hitler to house Nazi-certified art, almost certified with a hechsher. Ironically, there was not a peep of nervousness or contention in the Bavarian capital, the city scarred by the history of the Third Reich. The palette of the sulfur and black painting, as with the original work it evolved from in Chicago, refers to the identifying badges Jews were forced to wear under the Nazi regime. So this is like this contradiction, counter-proposal. And one day when I was going through Mel's paintings, he pulled a painting out and he said, "I'm just pulling this out to show it to you because it's not meant to be seen in public." I'm terrified and I'm proud to say that it is on view at the Jewish Museum in the Bachner Show right now, after much discussion, not just with Mel Bachner, but with our own educators and press people, like how would this be, how will it be received? In all of Bachner's versions celebrating his linguistic heritage and personal identity, a central thread has been the freedom to flaunt the recognition and level of comfort Jews have attained within American Western culture. These paintings, The Joys of Yiddish, are disarming, representing Jewish difference, comfort in American society, and the veritable assimilation of Jewish cultural elements into an American mainstream. However, Bachner's exploration of those positive aspects led him to probe deeper into vocabularies associated with Jews in America. Routing around on the internet in 2008, Bachner came upon a website with a degrading list of virulent anti-Semitic symbols of the word Jew, the grim opposite of Leo Rosten's celebratory tribute. The list shocked and unnerved the artist, not least because the litany of provocative language he discovered was so formally, textually similar to the collections of synonyms he was using the thesaurus to find. So consider this painting a kind of exorcism for Mel Bachner, a warning that anti-Semitism is still alive and threatening. And disturbing as the work is politically, visually, and culturally formidable. As with The Joys of Yiddish, Bachner again began with using a palette of acid yellow, this time on a brushy leaden gray ground. While the language of Bachner's thesaurus paintings often descend into the vulgar and embarrassing, in this work, it is a language that is repugnant and terrifying. The canvas is at once a direct confrontation with an appropriation of a lexicon of hatred. Radiating anxiety, it reminds Jews that racism and anti-Semitism are not merely artifacts of history, and that words can be used as weapons. The artist notes, and this is part of our label, that recent history has taught us that all abuses of power begin with abuses of language. And I think it's highly sensitive. And you might see Bachner's project as similar to some African-American artists like Glenn Ligon, who use mostly very tough text from African-American writers to force viewers to encounter the visibility and invisibility, not only of a kind of racism and prejudice, but of the invisibility and visibility of the African American in our society. What was even more upsetting, confounding, was that we hung this painting the weekend after the Kansas City massacre. So from looking at this painting as an artifact of history, it just became all too contemporary. Gay, Jewish, South African, the artist Stephen Cohen was born into a white, politically liberal family that was yet clearly part of the oppressor class. Cohen uses his multivalent art, part performance, part fashion, part decoration, part assemblage, to confront the histories of persecutions of all his various personas and identities. By addressing the complexity and ambiguity of his various identities and reconciling them with the history of numerous oppressions, past and present, Cohen has created a confrontational oeuvre riddled with irony and paradox. For all these reasons, his work lends itself to dismissal, ridicule, even arrest. Cohen has had a prolonged hospitalization in 1996 in South Africa for glandular fever. His experience of physical fragility, the monotony of confinement, and the vulnerability attendant to so severe a disease made him hyper-aware of his body and its potential as a new medium. He was not a performance artist till that point. Cohen remembers, and I'm quoting from him, quote, "I lay in bed for months and watched the calendar go by as if it were a clock. I was in amazing pain. I'd see my skin go yellow and my piss go black. I felt the needles in my back of my hands all night. I knew my body was a powerful medium, and I couldn't wait to work with it." Thus, Cohen's earlier interest in creating two-dimensional imagery on decorative-inspired type work, for example, his superimposition of Afrikaner antagonist, and that's on the right, Paul Kruger for the face of Alice in Wonderland, and the use of destructive tanks as decorative elements. And these were made on fabric and often were upholstered onto furniture. These tangible, tactile works were transformed to performative acts in which the artist appears as both object of decor and locus of action. In Chandelier, Cohen is using an elegant bourgeois decorative fitting, not only as a critique of poverty and oppression, but also as a cage around, an appendage for his own body. Cohen's performances are often site-specific interventions. In fact, they almost always are. Thus, their location, whether historical or political, become crucial to their meaning. He stages this action in a squatter's camp that was being bulldozed on that day. His self-dubbed anti-ballet, we would say, was juxtaposed to the government's inhumane demolition, which Cohen calls a ballet of violence. The flickering lights on the crystal-encrusted costume made evident the lack of electricity in the camp, the denial of the bare modern rudiments of daily existence for South Africa's subjugated black population. One of the most historically resonant performances related to Jewish history and the history of anti-Semitism was Cohen's Viennese action, Cleaning Time, of 2007. Provocatively dressed, he wears what have become his signature teetering platform shoes with either Valkyrie horn or menorah adorning his tightly fitted cap that complement his corset tutu ensemble replete with gas mask codpiece and decorated with a Jewish star brooch. Wielding a giant toothbrush, Cohen performs, better yet, outrageously reenacts the 1938 action in which Hitler Youth forced Jews to scrub the streets of Vienna on their hands and knees. Staged once at the historic Heldenplatz and later at the Albertinaplatz, Cohen again purposefully denigrated himself and flaunted his body as a painful reminder of the racism that remains inscribed and embedded in the paving stones of this former imperial city. Art historically, his performance also challenged Austrian post-war art, channeled Austrian post-war art history, in particular those performed by the Viennese actionists like Hermann Nisch, Gunther Bruce, Otto Mühl, and Rudolf Schwarzkogler, who enacted rituals and inflicted pain on their own bodies in reaction to the residual wounds of Austria's World War II history and the Fifth Republic's denial or refusal to acknowledge that part of history. As part of the performance, Cohen has himself known the human body as a site for personal denigration, infliction of pain, and ultimate destruction. If this is the classic lieu de mémoire, where history is encoded, even hidden by imperial grandeur of its urban site specificity, then Cohen graphically brings it back into contemporary memory. And we watch here as Cohen himself is arrested by the Viennese police. As evident in the work of Stephen Cohen and others, art concerning Nazi or Holocaust imagery has often provoked complex and contradictory responses. Nancy Spiro began her war series when she and her husband, Leon Golub, returned to New York from Paris in 1964. As an artist and an activist, Spiro was struck by the difference between how the war was presented in the US and in Europe, and specifically how conflict was mediated on television. As a form of immediate protest, Spiro layered images of helicopters, male and female figures, crematoria, bombs, both deadly and evanescent, along with references to past wars and present ones, including the contemporary conflict in Vietnam. Spiro was a highly politicized first-generation Jewish feminist artist whose work commented on Vietnam, but through accumulation of symbols that drew a correlation to the Holocaust, purposely so. In Spiro's war series, swastika images are joined with helicopter blades or those of an eagle, symbols of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and just military might. The connotations of the swastika problematize the morality of the war in Indochina through its connection to the Holocaust. The relations that such imagery makes have been considered problematic, and this is a continuing point of discussion. But it's also an aspect of her political and activist nature that of her work. And I ask this, does it redeem such usage? Isn't it the case that Spiro was able to use the imagery from one tragic disaster to bring home a point in the present? When she creates a counter image of a Jewish star hung with severed head, she instantly acknowledges the tragic deaths from anti-Semitism that runs from the Middle Ages to the Third Reich. And I feel that Nancy Spiro, who channeled historical imagery, was really looking to medieval Jewish illuminated text. Has the artist succeeded in making us think? Should we censor her efforts? After much debate about acquiring both this work and a work with a swastika at the Jewish Museum, we only purchased an image of the Jewish star. Maybe too bad in the long run that we won't have this pendant to speak about the history's symbols and numerous collisions of violence in the 20th century, built upon similar assumptions. So I was going to end my talk thus, with maybe a couple more sentences. Until 2 weeks ago, I was at the opening of a new exhibition at Ronald Feldman by the 35-year-old Israeli artist Gil Yefman. And I and many members of the opening night crowd were caught by surprise. And I'm not saying that this was the surprising work. I had seen this and a number of related works in Israel. A number of major collectors and critics there were familiar with the brightly colored, purposely goofy, crocheted sculptures. And these are totally handmade and obviously quite sizable. That are made up of representations of body parts, hands, eyes, and mouths, but with a particular focus on male and female genitalia, which protrude from the monumental spherical form willy-nilly. And there is sound that emanates from this also. Works like Tum Tum, which means stupid in Hebrew, also has pre-biblical medical reference to ambiguous genitalia. These sculptures are at once amusing and disturbing. They are part of Yefman's own flirtation with issues of his transgender identity. Although Yefman has clearly made the decision to retain his male identity, the artist hopes these stabilizing sculptures will force viewers to see feminine and masculine aspects of themselves, not so easily resolved. Yefman has created other sculptures with direct references to the Holocaust. His gray crib, or his crib made of gray and gold wool, with its barbed wire perimeter holding a gold tooth, is a fairy tale gone haywire. Its collision of symbols of safety and terror, of maternal nurturing and medical exploitation make the work hard to look at. Yet Yefman purposely seduces us aesthetically so we cannot avoid confronting its complex mixed messages. So the work that really got me, and which I have to say, I censored works from this, self-censored works from this suite to just show the least, to me, offensive, is his new series of screen prints, Timetable, which were made at the Jerusalem Print Workshop. Here, Yefman researched key Nazi female figures and presented them as images on a pornographic pinup calendar. Sourced from the archives of Ravensbrück, which was predominantly a female concentration camp, his perpetrators are all women. I and a number of other viewers found ourselves sort of curiously skirting that wall and making chit-chat and other avoidance behaviors, shall I say. But perhaps it's the power of the artist, as a reviewer noted in the extensive story on this project in the Israeli paper Haaretz, that the seductive nature of his works collapses the distance for viewers between the shocking symbols and one's own reality. Admittedly, I haven't yet worked out my responses to this suite or the show in general. Will I return to the Feldman Gallery to see the works again? I think so. I have always sought to uncover new artists, new strategies, new images, new meanings that offer alternative directions and models for that intercourse or interconnection between Jewish history and contemporary culture. For me, looking back into history and art history must always be on equal footing with experience in examining the art of our time. Too often, sentimentality and nostalgia have become the feel-good mainstays for traditional subject matter, even though the art and images were not originally so intended. In fact, I recently noticed that the time-honored nostalgia for shtetl life of Eastern Europe was becoming replaced by a yearning for North American suburban life of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So much for sentimentality. Some of us can even remember those periods. A willingness to encounter and understand, to confront and interrogate disobedient images or text is a necessity if we are to encounter and understand the full breadth of art experience. The contemporaneity of the themes and the disobedient nature of the imagery I've shown finds an echo in the current concern with trigger warnings in university classes. Whether they are Flaubert's Madame Bovary or Toni Morrison's Beloved. Students have begun to demand notice about potentially upsetting elements in the academic canon. This issue, and I'm sure many of you read it somewhere, was from an article just this May 17th in the New York Times. I quote by way of conclusion from Greg Lukianoff, the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and here is his quote. Frankly, it seems this is sort of an inevitable movement towards people increasingly expecting physical and intellectual comfort in their lives. It's going to get harder to teach people that there is real, important, and serious value to being offended. Part of that is talking about deadly serious and uncomfortable subjects, end quote. And if I might add to Professor Lukianoff's quote, that it's not just important to confront deadly serious and uncomfortable subjects, but it's also important to confront literary and artistic interventions and strategies that help drive home in an artistic and literary way those issues of seriousness and discomfort. Thank you very much for having me today.
For our guest tonight, please put up your hand. Comments are okay too, but this was very provocative, somewhat shocking, certainly interesting. So here we come. I'll hold it. It's okay.
Do you know if they're selling those pieces at the Feldman Gallery and who's buying them?
They are they are for sale. I haven't asked that question. I'm curious, and Ronald and Freda Feldman are sort of courageous dealers, and they will show art that will take 30 or 40 years to get bought. They show works by Muriel Ugeles and Hannah Wilke, and sometimes those works didn't sell for a long time because they were too provocative. But they're courageous, and I'm starting to look at these, and what obviously Gil Yefman is doing is putting a female face on perpetrators.
Our next question's here in the back.
Where does the quote, all abuses of power begin with abuses of language, come from?
That comes from the artist Mel Bachner. That comes from the artist Mel Bachner. Yeah, directly.
Other questions, comments? I see right here.
Hi, I'm not going to ask about this. Tell me about art schools and keeping, you implied they kept Jews out until the 20th century.
I have to modify that because I think I said art schools kept Jews out until the mid-19th century in Western Europe, until the late 19th century in Eastern Europe, and mostly in the most Jews did not enter art school in America until the 20th century. That goes back to the medieval guilds. I mean, being an artist was a trade kind of profession where Jews were not permitted in most trades. It's a long history, and it was only with the newly and very fragilely given civil rights that happened slowly and sometimes got taken back that Jews were initially permitted to go to art school. And in fact, in New York and in London, the Educational Alliance in New York and the Whitechapel, it wasn't really an art gallery, it was a local communal organization, were places that actually encouraged young Jewish teenagers to get art lessons, and some of it stuck, and they became the next generation of teachers in those places, but also professional artists. But it's a long tradition of Jews not being allowed in most trade organizations.
Next question is back here. Hi, I just wonder if you have anything more to say about the Dreyfus affair. It always seems confusing to me how it happened, and are the French still embarrassed about it? Are there other works depicting it? Just any, I don't have something specific, but anything that you could say further about it.
I could probably keep you here until next Passover about the Dreyfus affair, but I urge you to, you can still buy it online, my catalog, Norman Kleeblatt, The Dreyfus Affair, Art, Truth, and Justice. It's not that expensive. It was really the first foray into the visual culture around the Dreyfus Affair. And if you just want to read a fabulous historical narrative on the Dreyfus Affair, read Jean-Denis Bredin's The Affair. It reads like a novel. It's all footnoted and on a very high level of scholarship and literature. So it'll keep you busy, but not quite till next Passover, but for a while.
The next question's here to your left.
I was kind of mystified at your concern that the more recent Bachner, the one that wasn't supposed to be exhibited, was problematic. Because I didn't sense an overwhelming sense of negativity in that at all, in contrast with the ones that were much more caricaturized. I mean, just sitting here today knowing that he was born in 1940 from what I can quick read in Wikipedia, I have no reason to think that his knowledge of Yiddish is any more profound than mine, and the larger, more monumental works were completely negative. There's no positive word in any of those, and this, yeah.
They're more ironic. I mean, to me, it depends how you interpret the Yiddish. And
well,
your
I'll
Yiddish
tell
is
you
probably
what.
better
If
than
I
mine.
call you a pisher or an altacocker, you are fully entitled to feel.
Well, it depends on how you say it.
Listen, I would not be engaged in any kind of a positive sense by anybody who called me any of those things. By contrast, I would be delighted to be called a rabbinist or conceivably a Pharisee or a Chassid. These are not inherently negative terms. This piece has specifically negative language like Shylock and Dick, but it also has words that have at least historically been positive, unlike putz. So my question is,
right.
In what regard were you troubled by that piece?
I was troubled by the fact that, this is the internet writ large, and I see Mel's work as these thesaurus paintings, and I haven't shown you the other thesaurus paintings, and that's a lack of time, which Mel always likes to use negative language. He comes out of Beckett and Borges and Wittgenstein. He's not it's not a like happy face Yiddishkeit. He thinks it's funny that these Yiddish terms that he grew up with have become, which were exclusively in the 40s when he was growing up, something that was used by the Jewish communities, and now they've entered Roget's thesaurus. But this is, there's some things that are confounding. There's some things that are historically typical, cosmopolitan. I have never heard of a locksjock, and still sort of like breathe heavily, but Mel really felt, and it was more like, this is not for popular consumption. And at the same time, I felt anyone who is working so closely with language and working with the language of the street in his works, to come upon this and decide to make a painting of it. You know, what does that mean to him? And I think just to get that quote that I forget, the woman in back of you asked, the abuse of power begins with language. And it's something, you know, I stupidly never thought of before, but I think it's a very powerful idea. And if you can learn one thing from looking at this painting that is not about like, oh, I want to be called a cosmopolitan, or I want to be called a yiddle. That could be you that want to be called a yiddle. Maybe I would not agree. Then it's part of an artistic process.
Another question here in the center.
So the piece where the Yeshiva Bucher is looking out into the Garden of Eden, and that you showed us, and in kind of ways looking at modernity and the opportunity of being accepted in Western life, and the danger of that. You know, I think about that in terms of the last few artists you showed were Israelis, I assumed.
No, I only showed one Israeli artist.
So maybe I get mixed up.
One was South African.
Okay. How much has the pendulum of Jewish creativity started to shift towards Israel? Is it balanced towards the diaspora in Israel? Can you comment on that?
I think we have such the art world is so vast now. It's become, everyone uses the term global. You know, there are art fairs in Dubai, in Shanghai, in Korea, in Tokyo, and biennials all over the place. I don't think, what I was doing here is talking about the confluence of Jewish subject matter and historic and contemporary art. But I don't think we can make any kind of suggestion of Jewish creativity. There are a lot of artists who happen to be born Jewish, or some who were adopted into a Jewish family. Does that make their work Jewish? I don't know. You know, what does it all mean? It's and I think the fact that the art world has become exponentially large makes those kind of questions and assumptions of local political origins almost unanswerable, if not futile.
The next question's right here.
Okay. Thank you. Peter Bloom. I think I recognize the name, but I really didn't know his work. You said he spent 40 years in New England. Were there other works that are as vividly provocative as the one with the that you showed us?
Not quite. Mostly, Peter Bloom was known as a precisionist, someone who did work like Sheeler, very, very precise rendering, highly realistic to the point of being almost airless. But Peter Bloom did do one work and which showed, again, his like outsider looking in, and it was called Home for Christmas, also done in 1926. I think that's when he first started going up to Western Connecticut. That shows someone on a horse with a barn in the background, and it was like a New England subject. But why was it called Home for Christmas? Was this his home? Was this something he wanted to be his home? Or was this alien territory he had hoped to make home? I haven't hit the documents that much. There will be a Peter Bloom show at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. So I'm sure that curator is working right now to try to figure out what it all means, and our Pig's Feet and Vinegar will be in that show.
Thank you for your talk. One thing about the use of language, we need to remember that Yiddish is a great comedic, comic gift. And so I refer to myself as an Altacocker, a Christ killer, a kike, a sheeny. And I do that among Goyim, and I do it regularly, and so do a great many of my friends. Those words up there are not indictments. If we become frightened of them, they become bigger than us. Calling yourself any one of those names and identifying them with a laugh on your face takes all the power out of it. This painting here is magnificent, and one thing I was curious about your analysis of it was that I'm familiar with that parable. It's a study of consciousness as these four tzaddiks see into the face of God. That's how I've always understood it. And we saw 4 different variants of their awakening: death, delight, and departure. Did that enter to me? The last thing I want to say is, in your talk on rebellious imagery, the Jew who rebels against the mind control system thousands of years old of the rabbinate, to me is the constant theme. And this painting is magnificent in that regard because it's spiritual rebellion. Do you have any comments on that, sir?
No, I think I may use you as a footnote for my next talk.
One more question. We'll take a last question.
Right here. Thank you. There were some artists I never heard of, so that's great, and I appreciate you grappling with this question. Is there anyone you're just beginning to grapple with who might be too offensive, you think, at the moment to show at the museum?
Oh, I think I always grapple. I also grapple with artists whose work I don't like and may not have a Jewish aspect to their work or Jewish nature to their work. I like art that makes me angry. It makes me go back and look at it again, or sometimes avoid it until I, confront it in another setting. And I think whether it's art or literature, it's like, sometimes, reading Flaubert or Toni Morrison or Philip Roth, where you American Pastoral, you don't want to keep reading, but the language is so beautiful that you have to keep reading. And that's what I think is the great gift of any kind of artist, to use beauty to purvey ideas that we may not be ready for yet.
Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. Thanks to all of our partners. Mostly thanks to Norman Kleeblatt, and please join us for a reception in the atrium. Have a wonderful evening.